Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I will be showing you how the main parameters of a compressor work. And to do this I will be using the fruity limiter, but these parameters are pretty much universal between different compressors. If the compressor that you use is quite a bit different, you would definitely want to check out the manual for your compressor to figure out what exactly everything does in your specific compressor. So the fruity limiter has this nice window here that will show you the peak amplitude of your sound when you play it. And you can see that I have an oscilloscope down here just to give you guys another visual representation of what is happening with the sound. And a lot of modern software compressors will have this kind of window, and it is pretty nice. You don't want to kind of use it completely to gauge your compression decisions, but it's definitely nice to help you get a rough idea of kind of what range you want your threshold to be in and all that. So here's my compressor, and this is the sound that I will be compressing, this tom sound. Now what a compressor does is it allows you to manipulate the amplitude or the dynamic range of a sound or a mixer track. And so a few of the parameters you have on a compressor are directly related to the amplitude of your sound. And these are threshold, ratio, and gain. And sometimes the gain might be called something else. It might be called output or even something else. So it's definitely worth reading the manual for your specific compressor, even if you do watch this video, just to make sure that you know how everything in this video relates to the compressor that you use. So first I'm going to look at the threshold parameter. And the threshold parameter simply decides at what level your compressor will start to affect the sound. And so you can see when I take this down, a little line appears in the window here. And that is just a visual representation of where I am setting this threshold to be at. And in order for the compressor to change the sound, the level of the sound has to exceed the threshold at some point. So if I were to have the threshold up here, you could see that the sound isn't quite reaching that level and the compressor will have no effect. So I want to reduce the threshold level until it is below the level at which the sound is peaking. And specifically what level you set it at is up to you. It depends on what you're trying to achieve with the compressor. If you set it to higher values, less of the sound will be affected. And if you set it to lower values, more of the sound will be affected. Because what the threshold tells the compressor to do is reduce the level of your sound whenever it is above the threshold. So if I set the threshold higher, only this part of the sound will actually be reduced by the compressor, and if I set it lower, all of this will be reduced by the compressor. Now you'll hear when I play the sound again, it actually hasn't changed at all. And that's because I need to also set the ratio in order for the compressor to have any kind of effect. And what the ratio tells the compressor to do is when the sound exceeds the threshold, the ratio tells the compressor to reduce the level of the sound that is exceeding the threshold by a certain ratio. And so you can see up in the tips bar, if I adjust this, you'll see 2.2 to 1, 4.5 to 1, and it goes all the way up to 20 to 1. And what this tells the compressor to do is, if I set it to 20 to 1, for example, whenever the sound exceeds this threshold, the amount at which it exceeds that threshold will be reduced according to the ratio. So if I have the ratio set to 20 to 1, for every decibel that this sound goes beyond the threshold, it will be reduced to 1/20th of a decibel. So if your sound were to exceed the threshold by 20 decibels, the compressor will adjust that sound so that it ends up only exceeding the threshold by 1 decibel. when the sound is put through the compressor. And so a ratio of 20:1 is a very high ratio, and as you can see, it is practically limiting the sound at the level of the threshold. But I can reduce the ratio to give the compressor a much more subtle effect. So I might set it to 2:1, and what a ratio of 2:1 will do is for every 2 decibels that your sound exceeds the threshold, it will tell it to only output 1 decibel. So if your sound exceeds the threshold by 20 decibels still, the compressor with a ratio of 2:1 will tell it to reduce the output above the threshold to only 10 decibels. And if you pay attention to the oscilloscope down here, you can see that when I play it with the ratio of 2:1, it is peaking a little bit less high than if I turn that ratio back to 1:1. And if I increase the ratio, you'll see that the level just gets reduced more and more. But it doesn't get reduced below the threshold. So if I keep the ratio where it is and adjust the threshold, you can see that it's a very hard compression, and it is practically limiting the sound based on where I set that threshold to be. And so if I set it at a lower ratio, you can see this. It works a little bit differently if I change the threshold. It's still reducing the sound more when I bring it down, but it's not quite limiting it at the level of the threshold. So the threshold tells the compressor at what level to start affecting the sound, and the ratio tells the compressor how much to reduce the decibel level of the sound that is exceeding the threshold. And then the gain or output parameter allows you to increase the final level of the sound. So you can hear that the compressor has made the sound pretty quiet, but I can increase that level using the gain or output knob and bring it back up. And if I toggle this compressor on and off, you'll be able to hear that. What it has done is it's brought up the tail of that tom sound. So you get a little bit more presence in the bassy tail of that tom. Now the next parameter I'm going to be taking a look at is the knee. And some compressors will only allow you to select between a hard or a soft knee. Some may let you adjust the hardness or the softness of the knee, like the 3D limiter does. So it's going to change a little bit depending on what compressor you use. And certain compressors might not even have a knee parameter. But what this knee parameter does is it decides the way in which the compressor actually reduces the level of your sound when it exceeds the threshold. And so what the knee does is it applies a little bit of a curve to that compression. So instead of the compression being linear, like a ratio of 1:1 immediately, it kind of adds some curve into that so that the transition is a little bit more smooth between the compressed part of the sound and the uncompressed part of the sound. And so a softer knee will have that curve, but a harder knee will not have that curve. And the best thing is to kind of play around with that when you are compressing to see what sounds the best. So I definitely just encourage you to play with that and find out what sounds best for what you're trying to do. Now the last two parameters that I will be covering in this video are attack and release. And if you know anything about the envelopes on synthesizers, essentially the attack and the release of a compressor work in the same way. The attack parameter tells the compressor how quickly it should start affecting the sound. So when your sound exceeds the threshold, if your attack is set to 0, then it will immediately apply the ratio to the sound and reduce the level of the output according to the ratio. But if you increase the attack time, it will be a little bit slower to respond. And so when your sound first passes the threshold, it won't start being compressed completely right away, but that compression will be applied over a set time, which is the attack time. So if I set this to a very high value, you can see that the sound is pretty much unaffected. And here's how it should sound with that compression on. And this is because the attack time is set to 1 second, and the sound is above and back below the threshold within the span of a second. So the compression envelope doesn't reach its full compression amount in order to completely compress the sound before it is back below the threshold. And so, 1 second is pretty extreme, but using longer attack times that aren't too long can help you get a smoother compression sound. And I definitely just encourage you to play around with it and kind of get a feel for how exactly it affects the sound. But really it just determines how quickly your compressor compresses the sound. So you can see that with a longer attack, but not quite as long as 1 second. In fact, quite a bit less than 1 second. It's at 63 milliseconds right now. It's still letting a fair amount of that transient peak through before the compressor really starts to compress the sound. And if I didn't want that transient peak to come through, I would reduce it to a lower value. And now you can see that it's really reducing that transient. So the attack is basically how quickly your compressor turns on when the sound exceeds the threshold. And then the release is basically the opposite. So you can see that if I have a pretty low threshold, a pretty high ratio, and I set the release to be pretty high, there's still a fair bit of dynamic range in that tom sound. And that's because the compressor really isn't releasing very quickly. But if I take that release time down, you'll see that the tail of the sound is kind of increased in the level. And that's because the compressor is releasing as the sound decays in level, whereas with it set really high, it doesn't really stop the compression in time for the sound to actually let that tail come through more powerfully. So again, the release is just something you'll kind of want to play with and really listen to the sound when you're compressing it to get a feel for what you want. If you're compressing a sound to kind of beef it up, you'll probably want a relatively low release time. But you don't want it to get too low, because as you can hear with this example, it starts to get distorted. But the attack and the release work pretty much how synthesizer envelopes work. The attack just tells the compressor how quickly to start compressing the sound, and then the release tells the compressor how quickly to release the compression on that sound. And definitely playing around and really listening closely and watching out for any unwanted distortion is going to be the best way to get familiar with these parameters. But hopefully this video was helpful as well. Hopefully you have a pretty good idea of how these different parameters work on a compressor. And your specific compressor may have more parameters. Like the fruity limiter allows me to select between a number of different curves for the attack and the release. But what all parameters your compressor has is really going to vary depending on the compressor. So if you need to learn more about, the different extra parameters that your compressor has, definitely, like I've said, a number of times, just read the manual, and that should give you a better idea of any extra parameters that your compressor may have and what they do. But hopefully this video was helpful, and in the next video I'll be talking more about how and when you would use a compressor in your track.